Good evening, everyone. In the last session, we completed our discussion related to XML and JSON. This XML and JSON are used for sending the data from one application to another application. So one application will act as a client, another application will act as a resource. When one application wants to exchange the data, those two applications may be developed by using same technology, may not be developed by using same technology. That's why people will use XML JSON to exchange the data. To work with XML data in the Java application, we used JAX-B. To work with JSON data in the applications, we can use Jackson or JSON. So in the last sessions, we have seen how to perform marshalling, unmarshalling by using JAX-B API, and how to perform serialization and deserialization by using Jackson API. Are you guys able to practice XML and JSON conversions in the Java? Is it working for you? Yeah, perfect, guys. The next one, another important thing that we need to understand before starting our REST API development, that is HTTP protocol. We need to understand HTTP protocol. So HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It acts as HTTP acts as mediator between client and server. So here, as we discussed, one application will communicate with the another application. So here, as one application want to communicate with the another application, HTTP protocol will be used as the mediator. Here, assume that my application 1 is available, and assume that here my application 2 is available. Application 1, application 2, developed by two different companies and running in the two different computers. App 1 is available, app 2 is available. Now, this application 1 wants to communicate with the application 2. If application 1 wants to communicate with the application 2, then we need one protocol as a mediator. That's where HTTP protocol comes into picture. We need one protocol as a mediator. That's where HTTP protocol comes into picture. Are you getting my point? So this HTTP protocol will be used. So HTTP request will be sent from one application. Application 1 will send HTTP request to the application 2. Then application 2 will send HTTP response to the application 1. HTTP request and HTTP response will be available. This is going to act as mediator between the client and server. So in HTTP protocol providing below concepts. HTTP request will be available and HTTP response will be available. HTTP methods will be available. First, we need to talk about HTTP methods. HTTP methods will be available and HTTP status codes will be available. HTTP methods, HTTP status codes, HTTP request, and HTTP response. Before going to start our REST API development, we need to understand this HTTP protocol. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP acts as mediator between client and server. In the HTTP, we have methods, we have status codes, we have request, we have response. So what are the methods in the HTTP? So here we are having HTTP GET method, we are having POST method, we are having PUT method, and we are having DELETE method. So in the HTTP, there are several methods available. What are those methods? GET method, POST method, PUT method, DELETE method. this get method to get data from server, to get data from resource, or I can say server, or I can say provider. Okay. So if one application want to get the data from the another application, now my application 1 wants to get the data from the application 2. Then my application 1 will make a get request to the server. Suppose my application want to send the data. To send data to resource or server or provider for insertion or for saving. Any data that we want to send from client to server. Okay, to send data from client to server. From client to server, we are going to use post request. To get the data from server to client. To get data from server to client, we will go for get method. To send the data from client to server, we will use post method. Put method to update the data. To update the data at server. Delete method to delete the data from server. To delete data from server. So here, when the client application is talking to the resource application, let me make it as a client, and I can say it is a client, and I can say it is a resource. We can say this application is a consumer application, and we can say this application is a provider application. So when consumer is trying to interact with the provider, we will use HTTP protocol as a mediator. So when we are talking about the HTTP protocol, we need to understand what are the methods available in the HTTP. In the HTTP, there are several methods available, but we are mainly using get, post, put, delete methods as part of our REST API. When we will go for get method, so get method is used to get the data from the server. Post method to send the data to the server. Put method to update the data at the server. Delete method to delete the data from the server. So our REST API methods, we should bind it to HTTP protocol methods. Our REST API methods should be binded to HTTP protocol methods. Now, I want to bind my method to get request. So there is a method called get ticket data. Get ticket data. Okay, so that is binded to get request. So to bind this method to get request method, we will have a annotation called @get mapping. I'm going to develop a REST API. In this REST API, I have a method called get ticket method. Get ticket method is binded to get request. So that I want to bind to HTTP get method. How to bind that method to HTTP get request? Every REST API method should be binded to HTTP protocol method. So to bind our method to HTTP get request, we will use @get mapping. Suppose I want to write one method called save ticket or book ticket. I want to write one method called book ticket method. It will expect some passenger data. So this method contains passenger data. So client want to send the data to the server. That is a post method. To bind our method to post request, we are using post mapping. Get ticket data, book ticket. Get ticket method, I want to bind it to HTTP get request. Okay, so to bind the method to get request, we will go for @get mapping. Book ticket method available, it is binded to HTTP post request. To bind our method to the post request, we will go for @post mapping. To bind our method to post request, we will go for @post mapping. Are you guys clear with my point? Get, to get the data from server to client. Post, to send the data from client to server. Put request, to update the data at the server. Delete, to delete the data from the server. Our REST API methods should be binded to HTTP protocol methods. Get method should be binded. I want to bind my method to get request. Then I will go for get mapping. I want to book a ticket. A new record should be inserted at the server. Then we will go for post method at the rate post mapping. Now suppose, for example, I want to update some record. Okay, update product. So there is a method called update product. So here update methods will be binded to put request, HTTP put method. So to bind that to push request, we will go for HTTP put mapping. So when you want to do the update, then you will go for put. When your method is responsible to update the data in the server, then your method will be binded to put method. How to bind our method to put method? By using put mapping. When you want to bind your method to post request, then you need to go for post mapping. When you want to bind your method to get request, then you need to go for get mapping. Get to post to put. And here there is a method called delete. I want to delete book. Suppose for example, okay, I want to delete one book with the given data. So then I will bind that method to HTTP delete method. So to bind the method to delete request, we will go for @delete mapping. Get to post to put to delete. Right. So when we are developing the REST APIs, mainly we are going to use these 4 methods. So first you need to understand what is your requirement, what you are doing in the REST API. Okay. So in the REST API, what are the methods you are writing? And what is the purpose of these methods in the REST API? So if your method is responsible to get the data from server and give it to the client. So to get the data from server to client, we will go for get method. If you want to send the data from client to server, then you will go for post method. If you want to update the data at the server, then you will go for put method. If you want to delete the data at the server, then you will go for delete method. Our REST API method should be binded to HTTP protocol methods. Get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping. Okay, these are called as HTTP methods. There are some other methods also in the HTTP: patch method, trace method, head method, options method. Like that, there are several other methods also available in the HTTP. But in the REST API development, we are going to use these methods mainly: get, to post, to put, and delete. So similarly, HTTP status codes are available. HTTP status codes are available. So what are the HTTP status codes? When server processed our request, it will send a response along with the status code. HTTP status code is used to understand how the request processed by the server. Okay, HTTP status codes will be sent by server to client. HTTP status code will be sent by server to client. Server will send HTTP status code to the client in the response. Server will send HTTP status code to client in the response. HTTP status codes will indicate how server processed our request. HTTP status codes will indicate how server processed our request. Here there are some status codes like 1XX that represents informational status code. And we have 2XX, nothing but success status codes. It will be considered as okay. And we have 3XX status code. These are nothing but redirectional status code. And the next one is 4XX. 4XX nothing but it is client error. And we have 5XX. So these are server error. Okay. HTTP status codes are available. Server will send HTTP status code to client in the response. HTTP status codes will indicate how server processed our request. 1XX represents informational status code. 2XX represents success status code. Okay, guys. Now, 3XX represents redirectional status code. 4XX represents client error. 5XX represents server error. So whenever client is sending a request to the server, server will send the response to the client. Along with the response, that status codes also will come to the client. So server will send HTTP status code to client in the response. HTTP status code will indicate how server processed our request. 1XX represents informational status code. 2XX represents success status code. 3XX represents redirectional status code. 4XX represents client error. 5XX represents server error. 5XX means server is not able to process our request. It may be a code issue. So server is executing our code. I am sending a request from one application to another application. So server is executing that request. Suddenly some null pointer exception occurred in the server. My code is not able to execute. Then server will send error response to the client with the 500. 5XX represents server side some problem occurred. Server is not able to process the request. When server is not able to process the request, server will send 5XX status code to the client. Suppose client is sending a request to the server. Client is not sending the data in the request which is required for the server. Client is sending a request with the invalid URL. So when the client is doing some mistake in the request, then it will send 4XX, 400, 401, 402, 403, 404. Informational status code 1XX. 1XX nothing but 100 to 199. Any status code will come under 1XX, informational. 2XX nothing but any status code between 200 to 299. 100 to 199, 200 to 299, 200 to 299. All the status codes represents a success. 1XX means 100 to 199. All these status codes will represent informational status codes. 200 to 299. These status codes will represent success status code. Success means okay. Client is sending a request. Server is able to process the request and server is sending response back to the client. 3XX nothing but 300 to 399. Any number comes under this three category. So here this 3XX will represent redirectional. Redirection means I'm sending request for one URL. Server redirected me to the another URL. I send a request to one server. It redirected my request to the another server. That is called redirectional. 4XX is available. 4XX nothing but 400 to 499. 400 to 499. Client has done some mistake in sending the request. Client has done some mistake in sending the request. When client has done some mistake in sending the request, then it is called 400 to 499. That is a client error. Client is not sending the correct request to the correct URL. He is not sending the data which is required. So when client has done some mistake, then that is called as client error. So anything that is failed by server side, if it is not able to execute, then 500 to 599. So then that is called as server error. Client error, server error, redirectional, success, information will be available. These are called HTTP status codes. Are you guys getting my point? So in general, we can't see the informational status codes and redirectional status codes in our response. When we are sending a request from one application to another application, we will get 2XX status codes, 4XX status codes, 5XX status code. 1XX, one category, 3 category, we can't see in the response. We can see 2 category, 4 category, and 5 category. When I send a request to the server, server will process my request successfully, then it will give me 200. If I receive 200 status code, that means my request processed successfully. If I get to 4XX, 401, 402, 403, 404, that means my request is failed. That is my mistake. I'm not able to send the correct request to the server. Then I will get 400, 401, 402, 403, 404. Suppose I send a request to the server. Server side, code execution is failed. Then server will send 5XX status code to the client. Are you guys getting my point? After these 5 categories, which categories we can see as a programmer? Which category we can see as a programmer, guys? Can we see all the 5 or we can see only 3? We can see only 3 categories. What are the 3 categories we can see? What are the 3 categories we can see? Second one, third one, second one, fourth one, and fifth one. 2xx, 4xx, 5xx status codes only we can see. Are you clear with the HTTP status codes? Are you clear with the HTTP status codes now? HTTP is a protocol. That HTTP protocol we are using as a mediator between the client and server. HTTP methods, HTTP status codes, HTTP request, and HTTP response. So HTTP is a protocol that we are using as a mediator between client and server. Okay. So HTTP protocol provided some methods. Every REST API method should be binded to HTTP protocol method. Every REST API method should be binded to HTTP protocol method. Get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, like this. We have annotations in the Spring to bind our methods to HTTP protocol method. When we are developing the distributed application, every method should be binded to HTTP protocol method. When client send a request to the server, server will send the response along with the status code. Okay. When client send a request to the server, server will send the response to the client along with the status code. What are the status codes? 1xx, 2xx, 3xx, 4xx, 5xx. Like this, there are several status codes are available. 1 represents information, 2 represents success, 3 represents redirection, 4 represents client error, 5 represents server error. Okay, guys. Now, whenever we are sending a request, guys, in every request, here we will have 2 parts. One is request header, another one is request body. So here header will be available, body will be available. So request header, request body will be available. Response header, response body will be available. Okay, guys. Now, here, guys, whatever the request that we are having, whatever the request and response we are sending to the client and server. So here HTTP request that will have request line, request header, and request body will be available. Similarly, when server is sending the response to the client, response line will be available, response header will be available, and response body will be available. One packet. When a client is sending a request to the server, request packet will be created. When server is sending the response to the client, response packet will be created. Request packet, response packet will be available. Request packet contains request line, request header, request body. Response packet contains response line, response header, and response body. So this is called HTTP request packet. HTTP request packet. And this is called HTTP response packet. HTTP request packet and HTTP response packet. Sir, what is this request packet and what is the response packet? When a client is sending a request to the server, that request will contain all this information. So client is sending a request to which line, which URL. So client is sending a request to the other application. What is the URL of the application? That URL will be represented by this request line. Request line will represent to which URL client is making a request. To which URL client is making a request, that information will be available in the request line. Request header contains metadata. So client want to send some metadata, like some information about the request, information about the information, right? Data about the data, data about the data is called metadata. So client want to send some metadata to the server that will be available in the request header. And request body contains payload. Now, assume that this application is a make my trip application. Make my trip application. This application is a IRCTC application. Okay. So here, make my trip application sending a request to the IRCTC application. So make my trip should send the passenger data to the IRCTC. Passenger data make my trip is sending in the JSON format. Okay, passenger data will be stored in the JSON. That JSON data will be available in the request body. So always when one application is communicating with the another application, the data will be exchanged in the XML format or JSON format. The data will be exchanged in the XML format or JSON format. So XML data or JSON data, we are going to specify here. That is a payload. Payload nothing but business data. Which payload we are sending to the server? I will specify type is equal to JSON. Okay. In the request line, I will specify IRCTC URL. Okay. Request line will be available. Request header will be available. Request body will be available. Request line contains to which resource you want to make a request. Client application want to access which URL. That URL will be represented in the request line. And the client is sending some data to the server as a payload. Payload nothing but business data. That payload can be XML payload or that payload can be JSON payload. How server will understand which payload client is sending? Client will set the payload type in the request header. Header is used to provide some additional information in the request. So passenger data I am sending from make my trip to IRCTC to book a ticket. So my passenger data I am sending in the request body. What data I am sending in the request body? JSON data. How can I tell to the server that I am sending JSON data? I will give some information in the request header. So like this, client side application will create a request packet. That request packet will send it to the provider application. Provider application will take the data and will perform the operation and it will send the response to the client. When it is sending the response to the client, it will send HTTP status code and status message. So whether this request is processed successfully or request is not processed successfully. And some response header will be available. The header data will consider as a metadata. And response body, ticket data. Whatever the response server want to send to the client, that response data will be available in the response body as a payload. That response data will send it to the client. So like this, when one application is communicating with the another application, HTTP protocol will be act as a mediator. In the HTTP, we have methods, we have status codes, we have request, we have response. So client application will prepare the HTTP request packet, will send it to the server. HTTP request packet will contain HTTP request line. That request line will contain to which URL we want to send the request and what type of request you want to send. Client want to send get request, or client want to send post request, client want to send put request, client want to send delete request, client want to send which type of request to the server. That request information will be available in the request line. What is the request method? What is the request URL? Client want to access. That information will be available in the request line. And what type of data we are sending in the request body? Are we sending XML data? Are we sending JSON data to the server? What type of data we are sending in the body? That information we can keep in the request header. Suppose client should send some credentials in the header. Client want to send some identity data. Server wants who are you. Server want to get your identity. So you can send a request with your identity by keeping some credentials in the header. Request header is used to send some metadata in the request. Okay, then body will be there. What is request body? Request body is used to send business data to the server. Request body is used to send business data to the server. Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? Come on, guys. What type of content we are sending to the server? That will be available in the request header. Are you clear? HTTP request packet and HTTP response packet. Request packet contains request line. Okay. So HTTP request and HTTP response. HTTP request and HTTP response. HTTP request contains request line. Request line will be available. Request header will be available. Request body will be available. When it comes to the HTTP response, what will be there in the HTTP response? Guys, what will be there in the HTTP response? HTTP response contains response line. HTTP response contains response header and it contains response body. Okay. Response line, response header, response body. Okay. So HTTP request structure, HTTP request packet, I can say HTTP request packet, or I can say HTTP request structure. It contains request line, request header, request body. Request line contains what? HTTP method. What is the request? Plus request URL. To which URL you want to make a request. So I want to send a request to IRCTC URL and I want to send a GET request. Okay. GET request I want to send. GET request I want to send. GET request www.irctc.com/ticket/ticket ID. Some 134 like this. So this is the example of the request line. Request line contains HTTP method and what is the URL. I want to make a GET request to this URL. So when client is sending a request to the server, that request line will be available. That request line, GET request with this URL I want to make. Request a header. Request a header, it contains metadata. It contains some metadata. So here I will specify metadata. Content type is equal to application/JSON. Content type is equal to application/JSON. What is the meaning of content type application/JSON? Client is sending JSON data to the server. And here there is another header called accept header, application/JSON. So here content type and accept are HTTP headers. Content type represents in which format client is sending the data to the server. Accept represents in which format client expecting response from the server. Content type is one header, accept is one header. When a client is sending a request to the server, client will send content type and accept. What is this content type? Content type represents in which format client sending the data to the server. Make My Trip want to send passenger data to IRCTC. Make My Trip can send passenger data in the JSON format or it can send the passenger data in the XML format. So in which format Make My Trip sending the passenger data to IRCTC, that will be represented by content type. Make My Trip sending content type in the JSON. Make My Trip expecting ticket data from the IRCTC. How Make My Trip expecting ticket data? Make My Trip want to send the data in the JSON, want the response also in the JSON. Content type represents request body data structure. Accept represents response body data structures. This is metadata that we will send it to the server in the request. Hey IRCTC, I'm giving you passenger data in the JSON format. Give me ticket data in the JSON format only. Are you guys clear? And this metadata, the request header may contains authentication details also. Client want to send authentication details. If I want to process the client request, I want to pass authentication username : password. Authentication authorization, that information will be available. When you want to access my application, you need to send me a request. In the request header, you should send your authentication information. If your authentication is matching with my data, then only your request will be processed. Otherwise, I will not process your request. Request authentication details also will be sent in the request header. Request authentication details also will be sent in the request header. Are you able to follow me? Are you able to follow me? Token details also they will send in the request header. When one application is sending a request to another application, they will send token details also like this. Token also they can send in the request header. Authentication details, token details, accept header, content type header. All this information client will send to the server in the request packet. All the information client will send to the server in the request packet. Clear? Request body. Request body contains payload. Payload nothing but business data that client want to send to the server. That payload can be a XML data or JSON data. Payload. Example, XML or JSON data. So whatever the data that one application want to send to the another application, that data will be sent in the payload. Payload format. Payload nothing but request body. Request body. Make My Trip will send passenger data as a payload data. IRCTC will send ticket data as a payload data. Are you guys clear with my information, guys? HTTP request packet. Request line will be available. Request header will be available. Request body will be available. Request line will represent what is the method and what is the URL. Client want to send get request to this URL. Client want to send post request to this URL. Client want to send put request to this URL. Okay. Such kind of information we will be specifying in the request line. Then request header. Request header represents metadata. Client is sending data in the JSON. Client is expecting response also in the JSON. Client is sending authentication data. Client is sending some tokens. Such kind of metadata will be available in the request header. Then what is request body? Request body will contain payload. That is a XML data or JSON data. Payload represents XML or JSON. Payload represents XML or JSON. Are you guys able to follow me? Are you guys able to follow me? Yeah. Now, next one, HTTP response. HTTP response. HTTP response will contain HTTP status code plus HTTP status message. HTTP status code and HTTP status message. Okay. For example, it will say 200 okay. 200 okay. So whatever the request is sent by the client, that request processed successfully by the server. Server is sending HTTP status code 200 with OK. That means your request is success. I'm able to process and I'm sending the response to you. I'm sending the response to you. Response header. Response header contains metadata. Okay. This metadata will specify content type. Okay. So in which format that server is sending response to client. Content type, content length, content length. How many characters of data sent from client to server? So how much content is sent from server to client as a response? What is the content type? And what is the content length? What is the content length? Data. So when the request has processed, data. The date information also, we can send it. Whatever you want, you can add to the response. You can send that response. Are you guys getting my point? Okay. So the date also, we can send it. Like this, any information that server want to send, content type, content length, accept language, browser, which browser, all that stuff that can be sent. Response body. The response body contains payload. Example, XML data or JSON data. XML data or JSON data. Make My Trip is sending passenger data in the request body. IRCTC booking the ticket and sending the ticket data to the Make My Trip in the JSON format. So like this, HTTP request packet will be available, HTTP response packet will be available. So when one application is communicating with the another application, this is how they are going to communicate by using HTTP. HTTP will act as a mediator. And remember, HTTP protocol is stateless protocol. It will not remember anything, that conversation that happened between the client and server. Okay? HTTP is a stateless protocol. HTTP is a stateless protocol. What is the meaning of stateless protocol? It will not remember the conversation that happened between the client and server. It cannot remember the conversation that happened between client and server. HTTP, it will treat, it is a stateless protocol. It will treat every request as a new request. It will treat every request as new request. HTTP is a stateless protocol. It will treat every request as a new request. So that is the reason HTTP is called as a stateless protocol. It will treat every request as a new request. Okay. To develop the REST API, we should know below things about the HTTP protocol. To develop REST API, we should know below details about HTTP protocol. Methods, status codes, request and response. Methods, HTTP methods. HTTP methods represents what operation we are performing. Okay. So every REST API method should be binded to HTTP protocol. Every REST API method, generally, they are called as endpoint. One method is called as one endpoint. Every REST API endpoint should be binded to HTTP protocol method. Okay. Every REST API method should be binded to HTTP protocol method. Get, post, put, delete. HTTP status codes. Server will send HTTP status code to client in the response. HTTP status codes will indicate how server processed our request. Informational status code, success status code, redirectional, client, server. Are you guys getting my point? HTTP request packet and HTTP response packet. Post is used for insertion purpose, guys. Put is used for updation purpose. When we are developing the REST API, post is used for insertion purpose. If any method which is responsible for inserting some data, then we will go for post. Any method which is responsible for updating the data, then we will go for put. Post means insertion, put means update. Post means insertion, put means update. Are you clear? Explain about the token. Token we will understand in the future. So as of now, I'm just telling you what information will be there in the request. What is the token? How to send the token? We will see the development. We will develop the application and we will see that. Okay? Yeah, fine guys, good. So with this, we completed our fundamentals to start REST API development. With this, we completed our fundamentals to develop our REST API. Right? So what are the concepts that we have learned so far? What are the concepts that we have learned so far? Can I say we have completed the first part? What is a distributed application? What are the distributed technologies available? REST introduction, REST architecture, XML and JAX-B API, JSON and Jackson API, HTTP protocol methods. Did I cover all these concepts? Right? Distributed application. If one application is communicating with the another application, then that is called as a distributed application. To develop the distributed application, there are several distributed technologies available. Okay, right. Corba, RMI, EJB, SOAP, and currently we are going for REST. Currently, REST is the most famous approach to develop the distributed application, REST API. So REST APIs are used in two scenarios. When application 1 want to access application 2, we can use REST APIs. And similarly, if a front-end application want to talk to back-end application, in this scenario also we'll go for REST API. When front-end application want to talk to back-end application, in this scenario also we'll go for REST API. When one application want to access another application, then also we'll go for REST API. Okay, REST architecture. Provider will be available and consumer will be available. The application who is providing the services to other application, that is called provider application. The application which is accessing services from the other application, which is called consumer application. One provider can provide the services to multiple clients, and all the applications no need to be developed on the same technology because we are having interoperability. IRCTC is there. Make My Trip communicating with IRCTC. Yatra communicating with IRCTC, GoIbibo communicating with IRCTC. Make My Trip, IRCTC, Yatra, GoIbibo, they are developed by different companies using different technologies, but still they are communicating. That is called interoperability. If one application communicating with another application, irrespective of the platform, irrespective of the language, then they are called as interoperable applications. They are called as interoperable applications. Getting my point? So when one application is communicating with the other application, how they will exchange the data? To exchange the data, we are using XML or JSON. So one application will send the XML data and another application will process the request and will send the response in the XML. So to work with XML data, we use JAX-B API. And here, XML got outdated because it will represent the data in the element format. Open tag, closed tags will be available. So XML will take more memory. So to overcome the problems of the XML, JSON came into picture. JSON will represent the data in the key value. XML will represent the data in the element format. So JSON is lightweight when compared with the XML. So to work with the XML, we use JAX-B, marshalling and unmarshalling. To work with JSON, Jackson and JSON we have used. We are able to convert Java to XML, XML to Java, Java to JSON, JSON to Java. And today we understood HTTP protocol. HTTP protocol will act as a mediator between client and server. HTTP will act as a mediator between client and server. One application will send a request to another application. Make My Trip will send a request to IRCTC. IRCTC will process the request, will send the response to Make My Trip. HTTP request, HTTP response. So whenever we are talking about the HTTP, we need to talk about methods, status codes, request, response. So there are several methods available. Currently, we are going to use 4 methods: get, post, put, delete. Okay. Some people will use a patch also instead of the put. In the coming sessions, with the practical scenario, I will tell you when to go for put and when to go for patch. For time being, remember put. Put is used to update the data. Patch method is also available. We are going to discuss the patch in the coming sessions. Okay, guys. Right? Get, post, put, delete. So to bind every REST API method to a HTTP request method, get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping. HTTP status codes. Server will send HTTP status code to the client in the response. HTTP status code will indicate how server processed our request. There are 5 types of status codes are available: 1xx, 2xx, 3xx, 4xx, 5xx. So we can see 2, 4, 5. 2 means success, 4 means client side mistake, 5 means server side mistake. Request line and response line. Request line will represent HTTP method and request URL. Get request with this URL. Post request with that URL. Request header will contain metadata. Request body contains payload. Payload means any data that you want to send to the server. Business data, passenger data, or customer data, or employee data, or student data, whatever you want. Payload we will send in the XML or JSON format. HTTP response. Once the server processed our request, it will send HTTP response to the client. By using response line, status code, status message will be available. Response header contains metadata, content type, what content server sending to the client, how many characters are there in that content, when that content got generated. Such kind of information can be sent from server to client by using response header. And the next one is response body, which is a payload. So what is the response that server want to send to the client? That will be represented as response body. Are you clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? Come on, guys. I'm updating the class notes. Already I have done that update. RESTful services and microservices. Notes. Latest notes I am uploading in the portal. People can download from here. REST-API.txt. The latest notes file I have uploaded. Could you please check it, guys, in the website? Check it. The notes is updated or not. Please confirm. Is the latest notes available for you? Could you please check it and confirm? Is the latest notes updated in the portal? Payload means it is a business data that we want to send, guys. Payload means it is a business data. Anything that you want to send from client to server, that is called payload. Okay? Yeah, perfect. Good.